Russians should get ready to clear some new shelves because soon they'll have to put their teeth on them and punch new holes in their belts since they'll have to tighten them even more. Friends, this is the YouTube channel Ukraine Today and the project Topic of the Day. Subscribe, give us a like, and let's get started. As you've probably guessed, today we're talking about how the Russian economy is collapsing right before our eyes. One of the latest examples, the ruble has noticeably depreciated on the Moscow exchange. Russia's main source of income will soon dry up, and by a third at that, because new sanctions have been imposed, specifically a price cap on Russian oil. There are also huge problems with migrants and the workforce. Will they really start conscripting them to work? After all, they plan to send them to war, first and foremost. But even that is not all of the Kremlin dictator's problems. His younger brother is also going hungry. Lukashenko is asking Putin for financial help. All this and more details coming up in the report. And afterwards, an exclusive discussion.
It seems the ruble is on a downward slope. After the third round of negotiations in Istanbul, which did not achieve much success, the ruble noticeably depreciated on the Moscow exchange.
The problem with Russia, as with any autocracy, is that politics dictates the economy, rather than economic feasibility, determining the processes that should take place in the country's economy. That's why they were propping up the ruble there. But because they were holding it up so tightly, I think it was a request from the leadership, specifically from Putin. As a result, many export-oriented sectors of Russian industry ended up operating at a loss.
How could that be? So now it turns out that without migrants, Russia won't be able to overcome its labor shortage at all. But at the same time, the Kremlin isn't exactly fond of these very migrants.
We proceeded from the idea that it is necessary to update migration legislation in the area of state control over foreign citizens.
Now, let's go into more detail. The president of the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs stated that the labor shortage in the Russian Federation exceeds 3 million people. And he called for bringing in migrants, which, by the way, also won't really change the situation much.
The full-scale war that Russia calls the special military operation, what has it led to? First of all, a significant number of people have left the country, especially after the partial mobilization in September. And secondly, because the cost of contracts for the war against Ukraine was constantly inflated. This problem isn't going away. On the contrary, it's only getting worse. They are trying to make up for it with migrants, but migrants create internal pressure.
Meanwhile, the car market has dropped by 40%, as a result of which gays following Russia's largest car manufacturer AvtoVAZ will switch employees to a 4-day work week. And no, this isn't for worker productivity like in Europe, but in hopes of cutting costs.
They already want to reconsider salary payments there. They want to introduce fines if something is done wrong somewhere. Previously, they used to turn a blind eye to this, but now they will reduce salaries and cut bonuses. Attempts to save money also lead to an increase in the number of dissatisfied people in the country. It's already growing, but now the growth and discontent are simply accelerating. And this will have consequences sooner or later, consequences of the most revolutionary kind.
But that's not all. The collapse of the economy is already being felt by the owners of huge shopping malls.
For this purpose, the national project, Effective and Competitive Economy, has been established, and the President has set a national goal of sustainable and dynamic economic development.
Yeah, right, all about development. For example, the owners of the largest shopping mall, Avia Park, have decided to sell the property. And that's all because the government has completely closed off the possibility of Western brands returning.
One of the problems of the Russian economy, to put it that way, is that import substitution exists only on paper. So when you say that we're going to get rid of all the Western brands and have our own instead, it turns out that in reality, that's all just theoretical. In other words, when you actually create your own products, they're of a significantly lower level, of much lower quality. Accordingly, those business centers that thought domestic brands would take over are losing out because of this.
But Putin isn't the only one with problems. Lukashenko is begging again. The Minister of Finance of the Republic of Belarus is discussing the possibility of attracting additional funding from Russia.
Now Russia really needs to think because it already has plenty of its own problems. And now there's Belarus on top of that. From a logical standpoint, of course, Belarus should have been refused. But as I said before, authoritarian regimes are more likely to sacrifice not themselves, but rather the well-being of their citizens, to be more precise than to stop supporting their satellites. The simple reason is that they will always fear that if Belarus sees Russia not giving money, it will turn to China, to Turkey, or even to the European Union.
Meanwhile, Western sanctions have deprived Russia of many oil buyers. But now things have gone even further. Now even raw material suppliers are turning away from them. And such signals mean only one thing: the sanctions are working, and this is already becoming tangible for the Russian Federation.
Next, we speak with Doctor of Economics, public figure, and Rector of the International Institute of Business, Alexander Savchenko. Alexander, hello. Glad to have you with us.
Hello. Greetings to you.
I want to start by saying that Russia is being hit by a series of accidents and disasters that at first glance seem unrelated to each other. Well, what could they possibly have in common? Let's just take the last 24 hours, for example. What do a gas explosion that destroyed the entrance of a 10-story apartment building in Saratov and the crash of an An-24 with 43 passengers on board in the Amur region on Thursday have in common? But are we right in thinking that this is, after all, the cumulative effect of sanctions? We talked about this a year ago and 2 years ago as well, that sanctions don't work immediately and you have to wait for that tipping point when Russia will no longer be able to cope with them, with all its mantras about import substitution and so on and so forth.
You know, I would definitely add another significant case to this important list. This concerns the severe water shortage currently affecting Donetsk and several other major cities that are under occupation. Water is supplied only once every 3 days, and this is also a problem caused by the deterioration of the housing and utilities infrastructure. There are no repairs, no modernization, and everything is breaking down. And there are probably many more such points. It's just that crucial and sensitive information about the critical and deteriorating state of vital infrastructure across this entire country is unfortunately starting to significantly leak out. Indeed, the persistent and widespread shortage of essential spare parts and the lack of access to cutting-edge new technologies is progressively leading to the undeniable fact that the extensive wear and tear of numerous critical infrastructure projects, and not just those, for example, essential airplanes or vital locomotives, is rapidly reaching its absolute and dangerous limit. So, for example, they took an airplane and extended its service life by 10 years, but without the quality technical maintenance provided by Ukrainian specialists. I want to remind you that this airplane was manufactured in Kyiv 50 years ago and hasn't been serviced for 10 years now. And it is quite obvious that such concerning cases will certainly not remain isolated incidents, but will inevitably become the unfortunate norm, a widespread and pervasive reality. But I would like to add that it's not just this that leads to such a deplorable state and technical, well, not yet catastrophes, but problems. There's also a shortage of money. The shortage of money is growing. Indeed, the profitability of all Russian enterprises is sharply declining. No profit means no money for repairs and maintenance, especially, well, in aviation, automotive manufacturing, and housing and utilities. Yes, prices have increased by 13 to 14%, but that doesn't make it possible to cover all expenses, especially investment ones. This type of expense is considered investment, it's capital repairs and modernization. There's no money for these. They're not even included in the cost price. That's how it is. The shortage of funds is the second problem. And the third problem is the shortage of personnel. And there really is, especially if you look at the structural shortage of personnel. Well, they've taken drivers for the war. They've taken pilots for the war because our armed forces are effectively shooting down and destroying aviation along with the pilots. And so the shortage of qualified personnel leads to these kinds of consequences. So, well, I would say there are three interconnected reasons here, but there is a root cause, right? All of this is Putin's policy. First and foremost, it's Russia's war against Ukraine. And I've long come to the conclusion that this country will face real problems at the end of September or the beginning of October. That's when the shortage of funds will be so significant that Putin will be forced to cut spending on the war. He didn't misspeak at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum 2 months ago when he said that next year there will be a reduction in spending on the Russian army. Yes, there simply isn't any money left. That's it. So the root cause is Putin's policy. And there are also many other factors, among which indeed are the shortage of Western equipment, technology, and maintenance. I also consider Ukraine to be a Western country, right? This leads to these constant incidents, and there will be more of them.
Well, it seems they've decided to make up for the money shortage by turning on the printing press. Recently, information appeared in several media outlets that the central bank gave a secret order to print, if I'm not mistaken, about 6 trillion rubles. And what could happen if these unbacked pieces of paper are thrown into the furnace of the economy?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Indeed, they've used this tactic before. Then, through manipulations by the Ministry of Finance and Central Bank, they call it economic growth. In other words, they print money and supposedly count it as GDP growth. Well, I've long since come to the conclusion that there hasn't been any growth in this country since 2022. There was manipulation of the numbers, especially with something called the GDP deflator. What is the GDP deflator? It's the increase in prices not just for consumer goods, because the rise in consumer goods prices is called inflation, but for all goods, industrial and investment goods as well. In short, for everything. So by carefully manipulating this specific coefficient, they effectively turned what were initially negative growth rates into significantly positive ones. It's just that this year, it's no longer possible to hide it with manipulations, because then next year they'd have to show a drop of, say, 10%. And that's why this year, I'm sure they'll show 0 or maybe minus 0.1, 0.2. Well, that's a recession. That's it. And what you're talking about, when they print money and present it as GDP growth, which is what happened, this results in inflation. So they printed money. What does it mean when they print money and give it to someone? It's obvious who they're giving it to. They give this money primarily for the war and to enterprises in the military-industrial complex. When they printed and handed out 6 trillion, in reality, it means that 6 trillion was taken from the pockets of other economic actors, people, small and very small businesses through rising prices. It's very hard to fool the economy. In other words, it's like being a caliph for an hour. They handed out this money. A month or two goes by. The money spreads throughout the system, prices rise, and that money is already gone. And the second, of course, negative factor is the depreciation of the ruble, which everyone has been waiting for. When will the ruble finally start to lose value? Well, just a little, by 1%.
By the way, Alexander, sorry, but right now analysts are saying that the ruble has dropped because of the fruitless negotiations in Istanbul. Do you think this is already a trend and that it will continue to fall? Or was this just a situational thing?
You see, the ruble and its exchange rate in Russia are no longer a market category. That is, the rate is set by the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. They ask Putin what rate to set. Why? Because not everyone can take advantage of that rate. For example, you go to the bank and want to withdraw your foreign currency deposit, right? And they tell you, we don't have any dollars, but we'll give you rubles at the rate of 79. The real market rate should be, 110. Everyone is saying now that this is the real rate. but people are given 79, you see. That's why there are such manipulations with the exchange rate. Obviously, this leads to budget losses because foreign currency revenues are multiplied not by 110, but by 79, and less money goes into the budget. But over there, they just print money, sort of trying to get out of the situation. But I repeat, this is just a temporary fix. Putin, with all his might, yes, using the last of his temporary resources, is trying to bluff. He says that everything is fine with Russia's economy. But in reality, that's not the case. I repeat, Putin's time reserve is very limited. Well, I give it about 2 months. In October, I guarantee they will start howling that they are forced to cut not only spending on investment projects, which has already happened. Gref talked about this, and not just him. Yes, that's VTB Bank and Sberbank. These are the two banks that finance any investment projects. And by the way, these projects were what drove the growth, right? It's fictitious because the projects were inefficient. A lot of money was embezzled, and they didn't create any added value. But formally, they included this in economic growth, just like, for example, the production of rockets and tanks, which don't create any added value, but are formally counted in the GDP. And that's why you had that story where someone claimed that 3 million Shokhin, I think, right? Well, he used to be a pretty decent small business economist, I'll put it that way. Even though he was put in charge of overseeing the oligarchs, he's certainly not a financier and doesn't really understand macroeconomics. So his statement that we need 3 million in deficit, 3 million new workers,
Migrants.
not 3 million people that need to be brought in from Asia, and now they even want to bring them in from India, right? In reality, that's not the case, yes. Why? There is a real deficit, yes, but it's structural. Look, the workers at VAZ and GAZ, so they're not being laid off, but they're not working at full capacity.
4 days.
Yes, just 4 days. And in reality, even less than that, there are huge downtimes there. They're working at 50% of these enterprises' productivity. Where was this labor force especially needed? On investment projects funded by the state budget in construction, roads, road repairs, bridges. A lot of unskilled labor was needed there. But now there's no money, and those projects won't happen. Starting from September, there won't be such projects anymore. They can bring them in, let them bring them in, but then they'll end up leaving. After that, they'll only be sent to the army for disposal. That's precisely why there aren't the necessary resources or sufficient financial capital available there to effectively employ these additional 3 million workers. This is exactly what individuals like Shokhin, who genuinely do not fully comprehend the intricacies of macroeconomics, consistently fail to adequately grasp. I do want to say, though, that at the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance, they have a better understanding and assess the shortages more accurate. I think, yes, there may be a shortage of 500,000 or 1 million, but it's very difficult to address, I repeat, because right now we're seeing the collapse of investment projects that required a lot of labor. Second, where there is a shortage is in housing and utilities. But there, the shortage is of money, and it's unlikely that funding will be provided. That's why we keep seeing these floods, dam and bridge breaches, and more floods. Why is that? Is it because there aren't enough people to maintain and clean all these systems? It's because there's no money, right? There's nothing to pay with. So that's why structural imbalance, financial, human, technical will only keep growing. Let's be realistic about it. In this state, this country can go on existing for a very long time. The main conclusion, which is a positive one, for us, the only positive conclusion is that objectively, the costs of war for them will decrease if our partners continue to support us so that our defense spending does not decrease but actually increases. Then the outcome of the war will be predetermined. Well, it's not just because I'm a financier and economist, but many military leaders have always said that in a long war, it's the rear that wins. Whoever has more resources to support their army is the one who wins. So, well,
I see. Well, regarding migrants, it's very strange, yes, to observe when a country that, according to various estimates, needs about 3 million workers and is relying on migrants, including from Central Asia, but at the same time is conducting police crackdowns on them across all regions of Ukraine and is shooting itself in the foot. But let them keep going in the same vein. I think very few people would want to show up there now to save the Russian economy, Alexander, but you and I both understand that the chance, well, you say that Putin has a few months left before he hits an economic breaking point. But it's unlikely that he'll stop and start allocating less money to military purposes. So what happens if he continues at the same pace? What awaits the economy? After all, he could take more from some social sectors. Well, pensioners will endure for a couple of months. They'll learn to eat wild herbs and so on and so forth. You see, he might just ignore the population altogether.
look, they're already enduring it. In reality, all those stories about real incomes growing by 2 or 3% were just fairy tales. In fact, they were actually falling by 2 or 3%. Of course, the decline wasn't that significant. At this rate of decline, this country could go on for another 10 or 15 years. And in general, market economies don't collapse. Unfortunately, both Putin and the government elite haven't completely destroyed the market economy yet, unfortunately. That's how it is. But in a market economy, even a person like Putin, well, even though he's not really a person, right? Now they're fighting against demonic forces, right? The devil is bent. But I don't understand why Putin is allowed then. Because probably there isn't another person in the world who threatens and sends several 100,000 people to the next world every year. And most of them are his own compatriots. But this is the true devil, even though, as you know, they've banned the devil and are already arresting even Z bloggers and correspondents from the official press on that basis. Well, it's absurd. So whatever he wants, he can't increase these expenses. Why? Because then it would be necessary to reduce wages completely, absolutely. That is not to maintain, well, let's say inflation is 15% like it is now. Indeed, right now it's about 15%. That's why the central bank lowered the key interest rate to 18. At the moment, it matches the realities of the economy, right? But they raised pensions for retirees by 5%, right? In reality, that's minus 10. So starting around October, he won't even have money for this nominal increase. There just won't be any. And not just for pensioners. There are so many ochlocrats there, and they still need to steal too. And that's why Putin has started reducing the number of corrupt officials, thieves, because there simply have to be fewer of them since the pie is shrinking and there's nothing left to steal. But how will the elite live without stealing? They can't live like that. Then they'll start to protest. They might even plot a conspiracy. That is, if there's no fresh blood. They've already taken everything from the West, right? Everything they could, they've nationalized and handed over to their friends. Now they've started taking the juicy pieces from their own domestic businessmen. But even that is running out. It's running out. And that's why I don't believe that Putin has any reserves left to increase spending on the war. This is the limit. Around September, we'll hit that limit. By October, expenses will have to be reduced. You just can't keep financing a deficit, the one that's shaping up for them, right? They wanted 3, now it's about 4. But in reality, everyone says it's 7, 8, and most likely even 10 trillion, right? That's nearly $100 billion, which they don't have. Even if they sell off all the reserves from their sovereign wealth fund, it still won't be enough, right? They'll print more, they'll print about half of it. That's exactly what they're planning to do. But what happens next? What happens after that? After that, there are no reserves left, and printing more money becomes impossible. It's only in the initial stages of accelerated money printing, that inflation has a lag of 2 or 3 months. It doesn't spike immediately, and the exchange rate doesn't drop right away. Either it happens after 2 or 3 months. But when it becomes a persistent trend, inflation can even outpace the rate of money printing, and devaluation can get ahead as well.
Well, we've already seen all of this both before and after the collapse of the Soviet Union very closely. Yes, with particular interest and attention, you're right, we need to watch the infighting closely, yes, as they try to take money from each other. Because as we remember from our school biology classes, the most brutal form of competition is intraspecific competition. And as a rule, it ends very badly for those involved, which is exactly what we wish for all of them. Alexander Savchenko, Doctor of Economics, public figure and Rector of the International Institute of Business, was our guest today. Alexander, thank you very much, and until next time.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.